Welcome, Casey Davis. Thank you so much for being on the Karma You podcast. How are you doing today?
I am good. Thank you so much for having me.
I am really looking forward to this conversation. I've got so many things that I want to ask you, but I think let's start. Let's talk about this new book that you've got coming out, Who Deserves Your Love. Can you share a bit about what made you want to write this book?
Yeah. Well, it's so funny that, you're a podcast about anxiety because that's kind of at the heart of this book. Like my journey with relationships very much was kind of riddled with anxiety because I was always wondering like am I doing the right thing? Am I it like regardless of like there was a period of my life where I'd gone to rehab. And so, like, recovery principles were really important. And then there was a period of my life as I was in church, and then a period of my life as I was in therapy. And it was like every time I had to make a decision about a relationship, it was this really anxiety producing, like, okay, this is what I want to do, but should I do it? And is it the right thing? And is it the healthy thing? And is it the da 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 da, right? Like, it was just such a overthinking exercise. And so, this book is about how to think about relationships, specifically for those of us that might be overthinkers. And I basically asked myself, as a therapist, what are all of the things that I would tell someone over 6 months, 12 months of seeing me if they came to me about relationship problems? And, as a therapist, we're not trying to tell you what to do in your relationships. We're trying to give you frameworks for how to make decisions and questions to ask yourself and how to ask yourself what you want to do in relationships. So that's how this book came about and really what the heart of it is.
Yeah, so what are the common, so maybe for someone with anxiety then, what are the common struggles that they might experience in a relationship?
I think one of the big ones is if we have like a preoccupation with really wanting to be a good person. And I know that's kind of a funny way to put it, but I used to think I wasn't a perfectionist because I didn't care if my homework was neat or if my clothes were always folded nicely. But I realized later in life that I actually have a pretty big kick of like moral perfectionism. Like I really didn't want to get questions that I thought were moral or ethical in nature wrong. And what I found was because, like, when you have people who are really compassionate, we can fall into this trap where we feel like our boundaries and our compassion are in conflict with each other. And, one problem that we can have in relationships is kind of like demonizing people. Like, that person is bad. There's kind of this trend right now of calling every ex a narcissist, right? Like it's easy to kind of
Yes,
just
yes.
make someone this monstrous character and write them off. And I think for those of us who maybe have a compassionate streak or a real empathetic streak, we can make almost the opposite mistake where, oh man, I just really understand where that behavior is coming from. I just really understand that person's childhood. I really understand that they're not a bad person. They're just struggling. And sometimes that can be a bit of a trap in and of itself because, when is enough enough? When is their best not good enough? When do we need to put up boundaries, even if we understand where the behavior comes from? And, we might also do the same with potential. Okay, this person, and it could be any relationship, right? It could be your sibling, it could be your parents, it could be your adult children, it could be a romantic relationship or a friend. And we're going, okay, like something in this relationship is hurting me or harming me or is uncomfortable to me, but they have so much potential. If they would only do XYZ, this could be such a good relationship. And so I think that can be part of what creates a lot of anxiety for us.
Yeah, I can definitely resonate with that thing of wanting to be good, wanting to be nice, wanting to do the right thing. And I wonder what your thoughts on this. One of the things that I really experienced, I've been in with my partner for about 15 years now, but the first probably 5 years were quite hellish because of my anxiety and insecurity. And I always remember having this thought like, whose fault is this? Is this him? Is he being out of order or is it me? Is it all
Yes.
me? And I'd swing between the two. It's like it's all him, he's bad, and then it was like, oh no, it's all my fault. And this sort of thing. And I really, really struggled with that, trying to figure out like there was one answer to to that question or something.
Yeah. And that's actually one of the things that I mentioned in the introduction where I say, like, if you ever found yourself asking, is he the asshole or am I the drama? And you kind of go back and forth on whose problem it is, because the first part of the book is about how to think about your relationship. And it's really not about who is right or who is wrong. It's about like how we all come to a relationship with our own sensitivities and our own defense mechanisms, and how the interaction of those things creates something completely new. So you might have some of the same issues in relationships because you have some of the same sensitivities and defense mechanisms, but you're never, because you're always in a relationship with a different person, there is going to be some differences there. And it creates something new between the two of you. And so what we want to do is understand what that thing is that's being created and how it's being created, and look at that as the quote unquote problem. So that instead of us feeling like our partner or our friend or our family member is the adversary, we can feel like we're working together side by side on this kind of thing that gets created, this like hairball that gets created between our two anxieties.
That's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah, because I suppose you have your unique, I think about me and my partner, how we're like a jigsaw for triggers sometimes. Like he triggers
Ooh,
my
yes.
daddy
Yes.
issues, I trigger his mummy issues or whatever. And
Yeah.
like it all kind of comes up through this alchemy of the relationship.
And we call that the vulnerability cycle.
I was going to
So
ask you to talk about this.
So
Yeah.
you have certain vulnerabilities and I have certain vulnerabilities, and these come from our family of origin. They come from early childhood experiences, and they can also just come from like society at large. So for example, I have a sensitivity around angry men because my dad was angry growing up. So I don't deal well with men who yell or really even appropriate expressions of anger. Right? Like even those feel wildly uncomfortable to me and make me feel anxious. And then I also have ADHD. And so sometimes through things like that, like I have a real sensitivity around people thinking that I'm stupid, right? Because there was a lot of times in my childhood where I was disorganized or I seemed irresponsible. And then sometimes like just the fact of being a woman, a lot of us have some vulnerabilities around maybe what people think of our bodies or about aging. And so all of those things together, exist in us. And we create these defense mechanisms to cope with those anxieties and that pain. And so, for example, let's say that I have a real thing about being ignored and dismissed. Let's say that the daddy issues and the ADHD stuff and that like it all just kind of come together, and I have some real like trigger points around that. Well, let's say that I get into a relationship with someone who, let's kind of take your example. Let's say that they had a really critical family that was always criticizing and maybe was over controlling. And so they developed this real sensitivity to feeling criticized and to feeling like nothing they do is ever good enough. And let's say that my defense mechanism that I create to kind of move through the world and protect this sensitivity of not wanting to be maybe rejected or abandoned or dismissed is that I become really needy and really like a loud and dramatic and kind of hysterical, because if I get big enough and I make my feelings big enough, you cannot ignore me, right? But let's say that a partner or a friend that has that sensitivity around being rejected for, always messing up, they're going to maybe go, okay, well, if I just make myself small, pardon me, if I just be passive, there'll be nothing to criticize, right? I'll just kind of float away. I'll disconnect. I'll be very small. I will kind of like step away and I'll emotionally shut down and I'll just become a blank slate. So there's nothing there to criticize. Well, you can imagine then if we get into a relationship and it might start totally neutral. Hey, you didn't take out the trash. And if that, maybe he just didn't have a good night's sleep and that hits him right there and he kind of blows that off. And then I see him blow that off and I interpret that through the lenses of my sensitivity. He doesn't care. He doesn't care that maybe the division of labor is unbalanced. He doesn't care. Now I have anxiety. And now I'm going to use my defense mechanism, which is maybe I'm going to start yelling about it. And now I'm yelling. And now he's going to interpret that yelling through the lenses of his sensitivity, because now I'm criticizing and I'm commanding, and he's going to not come home after work that day, right? Oh, now he's not at home. Oh, well, my sensitivities of being abandoned are now exploding inside of me, right? And it just escalates and escalates and escalates. And it really hinges around the story that we begin to tell ourselves about what our behavior means.
So fascinating. I'm sure there's a lot of people listening and just feeling quite seen by some of those examples that you shared. Definitely me. Yeah, it's a wonder we can be in relationships considering we all have these triggers and these defense mechanisms that are getting kind of shown up all the time. I definitely think that, being in a relationship is such an opportunity to heal your stuff and to grow, but it's so painful sometimes as well. But one thing that I know you talk about in the book is how to know when you should stay in a relationship or when it's time to leave. And another thing that I really noticed, I think this is connected, is friends of mine who have later said that was a really dark relationship, it was abusive. At the time, they hid it from everyone. And as an onlooker, you wouldn't necessarily know. And I think they were kind of in denial themselves. So, it makes it hard for them to, if other people don't know and they don't know, like it can be very hard to know if they should stay or leave. I hope that makes sense. Do you know what?
It totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's these 6 questions in the book, and I call it a relationship decision tree. And it's specifically made to help you kind of walk through, because if you look at this vulnerability cycle, and I mentioned like the goal is to kind of feel like you're most of the time working side by side to try to address this ball of stuff between you. But if you start to work on your stuff, a number of things could happen. Like maybe you work on your stuff, and that in and of itself makes things so much better. And you go, oh, this is a relieved enough pressure from this that this really isn't kind of miserable anymore. Maybe you working on your stuff kind of invites and inspires the other person to begin to work on their stuff. And you do that together. But maybe you working on your stuff and they're not, or they're not quick enough or deep enough, or whatever they're doing isn't relieving the painful pressure of that relationship fast enough or deep enough. And so you really have to now ask yourself some questions. And at the end of this decision tree, there's really these 2 conclusions. And I think we could overgeneralize them by saying that it's about staying or leaving, but really it's more nuanced than that. It's about staying or disengaging. And so disengaging doesn't necessarily mean literally cutting someone off. It might, but it doesn't have to. It more means putting either emotional or physical space between you and another person. And so depending on the relationship, depends on what it is. Maybe it's a friend and you see them less frequently. Maybe it's a family member and you only see them in certain situations. Maybe it's someone you can't physically get away from, whether that is a sibling that you live with, a roommate you're stuck in a lease with, a spouse that you can't separate with at the moment. But how do we put more emotional space in between us so that there's a little more peace? We kind of disentangle ourselves from that vulnerability cycle. And they're written very non-judgmentally, because like to your point about abuse, I do talk about what constitutes abuse. But what I find is that when you're in an abusive relationship, like you said, you may not know that it's abusive, especially if it's an emotional abuse. And so once you say the word abuse, it really kicks off a whole nother layer of anxiety for us. And for whether you're a man or a woman, I think for a man, there's this struggle with kind of feeling almost emasculated, like I'm so weak, I can't be in an abusive relationship. And I think for women, we can experience something similar. Like there's so many moralizing like messages about abuse. Like if you go online or social media and you see someone talk about being mistreated, you'll get some empathetic responses like, oh man, you deserve better. But you'll get quite a bit of snide ones as well of people, I would never put up with that. Couldn't be me. And those kinds of messages are really damaging to people who are in abusive relationships because it's really complex. Most people in an abusive relationship have intertwined their lives with someone, and it's not simple to just walk away. whether it's emotionally or logistically. And so we have to kind of take the moralizing language out of it and just ask some very neutral, very open questions.
Excuse me. Yeah, really interesting. Um, could you talk a bit about how to know the difference between kind of, I think you call them like occasional screw ups and something that is abuse?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So everyone has occasional screw ups and sometimes big ones. Like, I think sometimes we want to categorize abuse and non abuse by what the act is. And there are some acts that we can do that with. Like, it's always abusive to strike another person. But one abusive act does not an abusive relationship make. So that's difficult. Now, that's not to downplay the severity of an abusive act. Anytime someone is hitting you or threatening to harm you in any way or harming you physically, anytime someone is touching you sexually without your consent or exposing you to sexual material without your consent, those things are always abusive. And they're never okay, right? So there's other kinds of abuse, though, that are a little bit more difficult to parse, like emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, financial abuse, things like that. And so when we think about something like infidelity or yelling or maybe even name calling, I think what I say in the book is, how many times does someone have to call you a bitch before you're in a verbally abusive relationship? And so it really has to do with power dynamics. And so when we have abuse, what we have is not only these kind of like harmful acts, but we have this layer where there is intimidation, humiliation, degradation, and isolation. And there's also a third category of behavior that kind of comes in between those two, because I think what can be difficult is to be in a relationship that's extremely painful. And something about you knows, like, this behavior is not okay. And this relationship is not equitable. And this is not fair. And like, we're not playing by the same code of ethics here. But you're not quite sure if it's abusive. Like, for example, if you have a friend that is constantly standing you up and they're apologetic every time, but you kind of feel like, okay, they kind of only call me when they need something. And every time I need something, like the conversation's kind of short and you're just kind of going, okay, I don't know that I would call this abusive, but at the same time, right? Or maybe you have, a couple and they have a new baby and she's had to drop all of her hobbies to take care of this baby. But like, husband still is, coming home and playing video games and going and cycling every Saturday. And it's like, okay, something's happening. And so what I call this kind of middle category is mistreatment. So we have screw ups, mistakes, inappropriate behavior. If those screw ups and mistakes and harmful behavior are happening repeatedly and a person is repeatedly refusing to address it, to work on it, even though you have brought it to their attention, that's when it becomes mistreatment. So I go out and I buy something really expensive without talking to my husband, even though, we've agreed we won't do that. That's a screw up. That was harmful. That was probably hurtful. If I do that once a week, several times a year, our finances are kind of struggling and I just refuse consistently to consider what he's saying, to look at the harm I'm doing in the relationship, I am mistreating him. If we were to look at abuse, we have the screw ups, we have them happening with a consistent, pervasive refusal to look at them, to address them, and there is an element of coercion, control, degradation, humiliation. So I think an affair is like a helpful one to kind of walk through. You have someone that maybe they cheated on their spouse once. That is a screw up, a bad one. It's not okay. I'm not justifying it, but it's a screw up. If it happened in sort of like an otherwise equitable relationship. If we have someone that is having multiple affairs, now we have mistreatment. If we have someone who is having multiple affairs and their spouse is financially dependent on them and cannot leave, now we might have abuse. This person knows they're doing it. Either they don't care, it's flagrant, or the other one is constantly finding out about it and they're just, you can't do anything about it. And they can't. They can't leave. They're emotionally dependent. They're financially dependent. They physically maybe can't leave. Then it becomes a tactic of abuse.
That makes a lot of sense to have it in those categories and sort of think about it in that way. Yeah, it seems very clear. Yeah. I was wondering about codependency and the difference between having codependency and interdependency. Can you share what is the distinction there?
Yeah, so codependency was a really big term when I was going through mental health treatment and when I became a therapist. And I think for some people it can be very helpful because it sort of highlights something that they've been struggling with their whole life, which is this feeling as though their emotional well-being is overly dependent on the whims, emotions, and approval of others. And I think that that is a very valid experience and a very painful experience and an experience that I have had. But what has happened with kind of the term codependency is it's gotten a little generic, as most things do when they hit kind of pop psychology. And I don't find that it's a super helpful term anymore because, first of all, I dislike that it sort of speaks to an identity versus just a struggle that someone has. And I also think that sometimes in our effort to want to not be codependent, we might accidentally kind of swing too far the other way and have this belief that we're supposed to never be emotionally affected by other people, that anytime we feel like we need someone, that we're being codependent, that we should be able to meet all of our emotional needs and live in a state of zenness, or we're not emotionally enlightened. And that's not true either. So the terms that I use in the book to address like what previously would have been called codependency is over-functioning and under-functioning. And the idea would be that like when we think about boundaries, instead of thinking about them as things that we do or things that we set or things that we ask other people to do or even decisions we make about our own behavior, we just want to picture kind of that space where I end and you begin. And what are the things that I'm responsible for? And one of the things that I'm responsible for is my emotional well-being. And my kind of sort of like general sense of who I am. And so when I am over functioning, it's often when I'm reaching over that boundary to try and control things that should be belonging to someone else. So like your approval of me. And it's recognizing that like, okay, let's say that you're my friend and we've had a misunderstanding. Well, on my side of the boundary, I do have a responsibility to make a good faith effort to explain myself. But at some point, that responsibility to explain myself ends, and your responsibility to decide what you think about me begins. And your decision about that is going to be partially influenced by my explanation, but it's also going to be influenced by a bunch of stuff that also is on your side of the street, your sensitivities, your issues, the other things going on in your life, your, maturity level. And it's about learning, like, when do I feel, according to kind of which relationship this is, because obviously I have like less of a responsibility with a stranger or a neighbor than I do with a friend of 10 years. But when do I feel like I've kind of met my responsibility and I need to kind of take my hands off of it? Because if I've made the good faith effort, I've explained, I'm so sorry that happened, that's not what I meant. Or I'm so sorry that I stood you up, there was traffic and there was this and I won't do it again. But you make the decision, no, I'm still going to be angry about this. I'm going to say, you don't love me and you've always been like this and you think that your time is more important than me. And I might go, my responsibility in that moment is to go, I love you and I'm so sorry you feel that way, and to have empathy for you. But at some point, it's not my responsibility to control your perception of me. It's not my responsibility to control your decision about my character. And so it's tricky, right? Like because we don't get to just go, well, it happened and so what? And like not give an explanation to someone who we probably owe an explanation to, or not give effort to understanding what you're feeling to someone we're in a, interdependent relationship with. But I think we've all had, I think maybe the classic stereotype is like the mother-in-law, where you say, hey, would you mind washing your hands before you hold the baby? And, sometimes they go, I can't believe you would keep my grandkid from me. And you're just like, that's not reality. So that's kind of what we mean. Like, yes, we're interdependent. Yes, we are affected by what other people do. But understanding, like, when am I over functioning and trying to control other people's feelings and perceptions and approval as a way of trying to manage my own feelings and self-esteem.
Yeah, when you put it like that, it makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of us who've, had anxiety, there is that sense of trying to control other people's perceptions or how they feel. Is that person all right? I was talking to a friend recently about when it's your birthday and you invite different groups of people, your work colleagues, people you grew up with, family, and we were talking about how both of us would actually find that quite a stressful experience.
Oh my
because
God,
we'd be
I would
thinking
never.
everyone needs to have a good time, really trying to control their experience and what they think and that sort of thing would probably ruin it for us, we were saying. But to know where that line is about what we're really responsible for and what is not kind of not our business really, or not something
Not
we
our
can control.
responsibility. It's so funny that you say that
Yeah.
because God, I understand that so much. And I one time said to my husband even that sometimes when we have big family gatherings where my side of the family and his side of the family are together, it makes me really anxious and it's hard for me to relax. And the thing is, it's like my side of the family is wonderful and his side of the family is also wonderful and they get along. But for some reason, I feel like it's my responsibility to like be the ultimate social lubricant, to make sure that like everyone likes each other and no one says anything that's maybe a little too awkward, or nobody says anything that's maybe a little too, this or a little too that, and nobody judges anybody else. And just like you said, right, like it's very anxiety producing. And that's exactly what we mean by boundaries. Like boundaries aren't about you will not talk to me that way or that kind of thing. I mean, that might happen in the course of having boundaries, but boundaries is about being boundaried and going, you know what? Like my responsibility was to send out the invitations and to try to make people feel at home. And it would be my responsibility to step in if somebody did something inappropriate or abusive or hurtful or harmful. But it's not actually my responsibility to control my sister-in-law's perception of my dad's politics or whatever, right? Like those like that's
Yeah.
not my responsibility.
Yeah. Could you say a bit more about boundaries? Because I feel like boundaries are one of those topics maybe that I get talked about so much on social media, and it's probably a few years ago no one was really talking about boundaries, and now it's such a common thing that we'll talk about. But could you share about how we can establish boundaries and maybe some examples of what that might look like?
Yeah. So the reason why boundaries was such a big part of my career is because I worked in addiction. And specifically, I worked a lot with family members whose loved ones were in treatment for addiction. And I would do family workshops and things like that. And so boundaries comes up a lot when you're talking about addiction treatment with families, because we often have two extreme behaviors. We have enabling behaviors where like loved ones are kind of scooping in and they're trying to make sure that their loved one never experiences consequences. And then we have these kind of like shut off or these like punitive behaviors, which is I'm almost trying to make it harder for my loved one or to punish them for their addiction or their bad behavior. And sometimes you have a family member that is just like maybe just a straight up bad person, like they're malicious, right? Most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time in both of those camps, you actually have someone that loves the person that is suffering, that they themselves are terrified and suffering, and they are trying to control the situation. So the dad who's real punitive, or the spouse that's real punitive, who's maybe like really shaming that person for their behavior or not letting them come to Christmas, they're doing that from this motive of, if I apply enough pressure, it will force this person to change their behavior, right? Like we do with children almost, right? If I give you a punishment, then you'll change your behavior. And the people on the complete opposite end of the spectrum are actually doing the same thing. They're thinking to themselves, well, if I go in here and pay your rent, even though you've spent all of your rent money on going to clubs and drinking and maybe buying drugs, but if you get evicted, well, then you definitely can't get sober. And so I'm going to pay your rent so you're not in trouble. And I'm going to keep you out of jail because I want you to be okay. And I want to protect you from having to experience anything distressing, because I know that when you feel distress, you tend to run and go use or drink. And so they're going, no, nobody say anything mean. It's okay, honey. We understand. It's going to be okay. Yes, I'll pay this for you. Okay, nobody upset him, right? And they're extreme opposite behaviors, but same motive. How can I control this situation so this person stops using? What boundaries are, as I mentioned, is helping those parents go, okay, your fear about your loved one dying is real and it's painful. You cannot use control of your loved one as a way to run from having to face that fear. Because the truth is, and I can promise you this with every ounce of my being and career and experience, you could do all the right things and your loved one might still die. You could also do all the wrong things and they might get sober. Like, you truly cannot even grasp how little control you have over the ultimate outcome of the situation. And that is the most existentially terrifying reality in the world. And we don't want to look at that, but we have to. And once you can accept that, then you can begin to look at, okay, if I can't control what they do, what can I do? Well, you can look at what your responsibilities are. And so it's not your responsibility to pay for their rent. It doesn't mean you can't ever. It's not your responsibility to shame or punish them into changing. So then you have loved ones that are going, well, I guess I don't know what my responsibilities are. And so let me just give you some examples of kind of what happens after someone gets boundaries, is that you'll find maybe a parent of an adult child say to their adult children, you can't live at home anymore because you're using, and because I have other young children and my responsibility is to protect them. Whereas you're an adult and my responsibility isn't to house you if housing you comes in conflict with my responsibility to protect my young children. I love you. You'll always be my kid. And it's going to always be my responsibility to let you know that you are loved. And I will always pick up the phone when you call me. And I would love to go buy you some lunch, and sit down and hear about you. Now, if you come and you're verbally abusive, I'll have to leave because it's my responsibility to protect my own psychological safety and well-being. But I do still love you. You'll have spouses that'll say, I personally feel like where we are with our journey, it is my responsibility to not leave this marriage yet, to work on this. But it's also my responsibility to protect my own well-being. And so we can't live together right now. I'll still talk to you. Maybe we can go on dates, but you need to go live in a sober living house and I need to live at home. We need to have some separation. I need to remove myself from the chaos. You'll have people say, actually, in looking at this whole situation, I need to never speak to you again because I've been hanging on for years and years and years and years because I thought it was my responsibility to take care of you. But the harm has outweighed all. I reached my responsibilities to this years ago, and I have been ignoring my responsibilities to myself. So you can see how it's a very nuanced outcome. You can't really just generalize what someone should do. But again, that's why we have those questions, those 6 questions. They are to help you get to the bottom. And then there's an exercise about how you get to the specifics of, okay, I'll always answer when you call. Or sometimes it is, I'm going to pay your rent, but I'm sending the check directly to the landlord because it tends to divert when I give it to you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Would that work for sort of different scenarios, do you think, to really think about what your responsibility is to in that moment? So you could use it when you're thinking about your boundaries to come back to that question.
Yeah. I think, let's say that you have a friend that is going through a really, really hard time. And you have a lot of compassion for that, but you also have a lot of pain because you're always being there for them, but they're not able to be there for you. But maybe you're worried to not ever pick up the phone, or you're worried to not always drop everything and go to them. And so you're not making other friends, or you're not kind of going to other places. And thinking about like, what are my responsibilities in this situation? And again, there's lots of exercises in the book to help you thresh that out. But you might go, okay, I feel like it's my responsibility that I want to do, of course, to be there for this person. But I also recognize that this person cannot be there for me, and I have real support needs. And so I need to branch out and make new friends and have new relationships. I need to go out on, the weekends and go have fun with other people. And I need to sometimes be okay when that person calls saying, I'm so sorry, I can't tonight. I've already made plans. I think we want things to be really black and white. Do I always drop everything and run because they're going through such a hard time? And what if I don't come and they kill themselves, right? Now, obviously, that's an extreme example, but just to highlight the fear and anxiety we feel, right? Or it could be as simple as, what if I'm a bad friend? Or we want, you know what? Their responsibility is to take care of their own mental health, and you don't owe them anything, and go out and have your friends and let them figure it out. But the truth is, like, we do owe people things, and we want to meet our responsibilities to people. That's where some of that anxiety comes from. And so I think that, it's not pour yourself out until you're empty. I mean, one of the things that I love to say that I've been saying for years to families is like, you are never under any obligation to set yourself on fire to keep somebody else warm. But it may be your responsibility to not pass by a freezing man. And so how do we find all of the nuances and gray areas between those two things? Can I help you gather firewood? Can I loan you a lighter? Can I sit with you for a few moments? And at the end of the day, if I've done those things according to my responsibilities and the things that don't take me away from my other responsibilities, right? If you continue to walk away and lay in the snow, like, at some point, I can't control whether you're deciding to freeze to death. And I'm not going to chase you, and I'm not going to set myself on fire for it, right? All these kind of things.
Yeah, yeah. Can you share about bids for connection and why that's so important in relationships?
Yeah, so there's this really famous marriage therapist couple called John and Julie Gottman. And they have done a lot of research on kind of what makes marriages work and why certain marriages break up. And one of the things that they discovered, they did this really interesting study where they invited all of these couples to a bed and breakfast. And they observed them over a weekend and kind of what their behaviors were and what they did. And then they kind of followed them for about 6 years. And they went and saw them all 6 years later and saw who was still together and who wasn't, and who was happy and who wasn't. And what they found was that the couples that were together, there was this behavior that they all had in common. And not just, and when I say together, I mean like the happy and together. The ones that were happy, there was this behavior that they all had in common. And it was what they refer to as turning towards bids. And so a bid is any little moment of connection, specifically kind of an ask for connection. And a good way to think about this is like, start by thinking about like big bids. You go to someone's house with flowers and balloons and a big sign that says, will you go to homecoming with me? Right? Like, that's a bid. Like, you're asking them, it's kind of vulnerable. They have to respond with yes, no, or ew, go away, you're a nerd. Then I want you to think, like, take that down to like the smallest way that you can kind of bid for someone's attention or connection, which is, let's say that, I think the one I use in the book is like, my husband walks in and I'm listening to music and he does like a silly dance. I mean, like, silly. He's not just doing that because he like felt in the mood for dancing. Like, he did that to be funny, but more specifically, he did that for a moment where maybe I would turn around and laugh with him, or that maybe I would do like whatever I'm doing, like this kind of moment of connection where I say, I see you and you see me, right? And it could be I reaching out to hold your hand. It could be, hey, this really funny thing happened at work today. hey, I think the example that they use in their study is, wow, look at that really pretty bird over there. And there's 3 ways that a person can respond to a bid. So let's take the bird example. If I say, hey, look at that really pretty bird over there, my husband can turn into that bid and he can stop what he's doing for a second and he can look at the bird and he can go, huh, that is really pretty. He could turn away from that bid by saying, I'm busy right now. I'm doing something right now. I'm not really into birds. And he can also turn against that bid by kind of almost being like aggressive or condescending or hurtful and saying like, God, stop interrupting me. I don't care about your stupid birds. So that's kind of the concept of bids. And it's been around for a long time. But what I noticed was happening kind of in the world of self-help and in the world of therapy is that when people would talk about bids, they would talk about it as they would kind of get like the cart before the horse. They'd have this couple that was unhappy and they didn't seem to like each other. They go, well, we just need to learn how to respond to each other's bids. But the thing is that at the core of bids is just like liking someone and enjoying their presence. And sometimes you're in a relationship with someone that you do really like, but your communication styles are different, or maybe your neurotypes are different. And so you think that you're bidding and they're not picking up that that's what you're doing. Or you think you're responding to a bid, but it's not clear to them that that's what you were doing. So you feel like you're being loving, but they're not feeling loved. In that instance, it's totally appropriate to talk about bids and how can we turn into each other's bids and how can we do it in a way that the other person feels it. But sometimes I found that therapists were trying to talk about bids with couples where I was going like, I don't think these people like each other. Like you can't make people like each other by like teaching them how to turn into bids. And I think that's really important. I think a lot of people needed to hear that. And I also think that sometimes we hear these examples of turning into bids and we think, well, that sounds like pretend. I don't care about birds. I don't care about what happened at work today. And I think it's important that we really address that you don't have to pretend. That it's not just about pretending you like birds or pretending you're into some hobby. Like it's about like, is there a place in you that enjoys your partner's enjoyment? Like the desire it doesn't have to be a desire to listen to the 900th modification that they've made to their, rifle. The desire is this person is excited to talk to me and what an honor to be the person that they want to come to. And so that's kind of what bids are all about. And it also doesn't mean that you have to respond to them all the time. I think in the study, it was like people who turned into bids like 80% of the time or 70% of the time were happy 6 years later. And people who turned into the bids only 33% of the time weren't happy or were divorced 6 years later.
So is it more of a sign of whether people like each other rather than a hack that you can kind of reverse engineer to improve, improve your relationship?
That's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, I think for a large portion of people, it's like a signpost more than a hack. But I do want to acknowledge, especially if you have like a mixed neurotype couple, so like maybe one person is autistic or one person is ADHD, or maybe you came from like very different cultures where like those kind of expressions are just different. Like sometimes it is just a communication issue. But I don't want people to think, oh, it's just a communication issue. If she just learned how to, it's like, well, no, maybe she doesn't care. Maybe she doesn't value the relationship and that should be like what you're really listening to here.
Yeah, gosh, super interesting. I wanted to ask you about another of your books, and this actually for me ties into the relationship stuff. So you've written a book about how to keep house while drowning, and I realized just literally today before we spoke, I didn't sort of connect the dots, but someone had mentioned this book to me and it stuck in my head of like, this is really important. And then I haven't read it yet, but I need to read it. But probably a big argument that I have in my house is about tidying. And I don't know if I don't know. I think for a lot of people, maybe it's an anxiety thing. I don't know. Maybe it's a woman thing. If the house is untidy, there's something stressful about that. Mm-hmm. And it might be, I know you talk about the kind of the morality that we place on it. Like you're not a good person if you've got like a pile of washing in the corner or whatever. But that is a big argument that we have about who does tidying, who doesn't do as much tidying as the other person, for example. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about your this other book that you've written, and
Yeah.
I don't know, any advice for those couples out there that are
Yes,
arguing
so much
about doing the
advice.
laundry.
Yeah, so How to Keep House While Drowning is also very much sort of talking about anxiety too. And so what I would say in that situation, and it's similar honestly to the relationship book where we're going, okay, here's the issue. Here's how we're going to get one layer beneath it. And here's how we're going to get even a deeper layer beneath that. And then that layer is what's going to tell us what to do next. And so in your example here, it's like, okay, when you're going, we're having this conflict because I'm really anxious when the house is a mess. Well, first we want to ask, what is that anxiety about? Because there's different reasons why people feel anxious in a mess. And let me give you some examples. One, you might feel anxious in a mess because, like you mentioned, there's kind of this morality component. It's like, I don't feel like I'm a good mother. I don't feel like I'm being a good spouse. I feel like people are judging me. I'm judging myself. I feel lazy. That's one thing. And that's going to be a totally different, way to go to address that than some of these other things. It could be you're anxious because you're the one who's going to have to deal with it. So some, especially women, feel anxiety in the mess because whether it's their children or whether it's their spouse, they know that they're going to have to deal with this later. And so that typically means there's a bit of an unequal division of labor, or we have just a really big mismatch in like standards. So sometimes it's that, right? It could be that you have some underlying anxiety in general. You have a generalized anxiety disorder or something like that. And one of the ways you've learned to cope with that is just to have nothing ever out of its place. It could be that even maybe there's some OCD there, there's some depression there, like maybe there's something else there that keeping everything clean and tidy and perfect has become a coping mechanism. And it's not right, wrong, good, or bad, but it's either working or it's not working. And maybe it worked as long as you lived by yourself and had complete control over whether things went back immediately after they were used. But now you're living with other people, or now you have children, and it's not working anymore because it's just not realistic that everything's going to go back where it was immediately. Because the other thing to remember is that when you live with a partner that has a lower level of tolerance for mess, having to be hyper vigilant about mess is anxiety producing. So you end up in this argument about whose anxiety matters more. Instead of going, both of us have some anxiety around this. And it is so uniquely difficult to deal with this kind of anxiety because it's your home. It's supposed to be the one place where you have sanctuary. You go to work and you deal with the anxiety of doing well or not doing well and on the deadlines and this, and you get in the office, in the, traffic, and it's anxiety producing, and you're dealing with your friends and you're thinking about the social implications. You're supposed to be able to go home and just relax. And it's hard when you go home and there's just more anxiety and there's more tension around tidying and things like that. So that's kind of one thing too. So there's different ways to approach it depending on where that anxiety is coming from. If it's a like unequal labor, there's a really great book called Fair Play by Eve Rodsky that is killer in helping couples figure out systems for splitting labor evenly. In my own book, there's one chapter about splitting labor evenly where I basically talk about we need to get away from this idea of trying to make the labor equal and instead, or like the housework equal, and instead make the rest fair. So that would take a whole other podcast to get into. But basically, it's not fair or equal if one person's always on. One person always has to be doing something to keep things going, and the other one gets to just like clock in and clock out of their job, come home, put their feet up. So that's, everyone deserves time to be off. Everyone deserves time to not have to get up and do things. That's what that's about. So that's, if it's about an unequal division of labor, there's that. It may be that you need some therapy or some medication or some things to help with some underlying things. And it might be that you just need some new and different, like routines to approach things. So, a small example might be, I have a laundry basket, a trash can, and these things don't go here bin in every single room. so that when I do feel like, okay, it's a little too messy in here for me to relax, instead of having to go on like a 3 hour deep clean or run all around the house, it takes me like 3 minutes to just put things into those bins. And then, we can have a once a week deep clean where we go around and get all the bins or whatever. Sometimes I'll talk to mothers who feel really overwhelmed because they're in that season of childhood where their kids are kind of exploding the house, and you just feel like, I think somebody called it like brushing your teeth while eating Oreos, and we'll say, okay, and they're like, I just can't relax unless there's this peaceful environment. We'll say, okay, is there somewhere in your house that you can make a peaceful environment? Maybe it's your bedroom and you just got, actually, kids aren't allowed in my bedroom. And some will go, oh, that's sacrilege. Well, you know what? Who cares? That's our boundary. Maybe it's that there's a one corner of the house that you have a really comfortable chair and a reading nook. And then someone was like, yeah, but when I'm sitting there, I can see the house. And I went, turn the chair around, turn it around. So it's facing out a window. So it's facing at a wall where you put some really pretty art on the wall. Like, try to find one area that you can keep perfect and no one's allowed there, and that can be your sanctuary. And so these are just small examples of like how we can begin to workshop these things depending on what the actual anxiety is.
Yeah, gosh. Yeah, a lot to think about there. I was just thinking about the fact that there's Lego in my bed right now because my son has just my 2.5-year-old's opened a whole thing of Lego, but at least the kitchen table is tidy currently.
Yeah.
For now.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So one question I always ask my guests is, what's one thing that you're struggling with at the moment, and how are you kind of handling that or moving through that at the minute?
Oh my goodness. So I mentioned earlier I've got ADHD, and one of the things that I've sort of been able to recognize about myself is that I get into these like hyperfixations where I'm really, really excited about something. And I love these moments, and I'm so privileged to be able to have kind of the freedom to pursue kind of whatever comes up. But the problem is that sometimes that leaves me like leaving things undone or moving on from things. And what will happen to me sometimes is that I will get really hyper focused about a subject, and then I will, like, for example, like really like cleaning house, relationships. All of my books are a result of some hyperfixation I've had, where for a year or more, it's all I thought about, all I talked about, all I researched about, all I wrote about. And, but books, when you publish them, take quite a long time to publish. And what happens is that by the time I'm finished like writing something, I'm boom, on to the next thing. But there's still so much work to be done, and so much, marketing and press, and I need to be making content about those books, and I need to be making sure people know about those books. Meanwhile, my brain has like moved on to some other topic. And all I want to do is sit down 12 hours a day and immerse into that topic. And I know maybe that sounds silly for that to be a struggle, but like it is. Like I have to, like I work for myself, and yet I have to be my boss and like make myself have discipline and focus on things that don't feel exciting to me at the moment. And so that's kind of like my big struggle at the moment is like, nope, you have other responsibilities. You can't just sit down and write a fantasy book today.
Yeah. You're actually not the first author to say that. I'm sure, I can't remember who, but somebody was saying the kind of, yeah, you kind of put that project to bed, but then all the promo happens like a year later or longer, and you've got to kind of remember it or get excited about it when you've kind of moved on in your life in a sense. But yeah, that's really, yeah, good to get that behind the scenes. Thank you so much for everything you shared. It's so insightful, and I hope people will come and find you on TikTok and Instagram and learn more from you, and obviously buy your book. But yeah, where can people find you and learn more about you?
So my website is strugglecare.com. And from there, you can kind of get to everything. I'm Domestic Blisters on TikTok. I'm Struggle Care on Instagram and Facebook. I have a TED Talk that you can get to from the website. I have a little store. Links to where to get all of my books are there as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.